Thank you, and welcome to this panel on documents and archives in the Mamluk period. We actually only have 4 papers this morning. Tamara Lathy was not able to, or 3, sorry, yes, 3 papers. We had 4, now we have 3. It's jet lag. Tamara wasn't able to make it to the conference, and so we'll be, that gives us a little bit, maybe extra time for questions at the end. Or for coffee and such thereafter, if you prefer. So we'll go in order then, and we'll begin with Garrett Davidson of the College of Charleston, speaking on paratextual reading and audition notices in Mamluk manuscripts.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I apologize in advance. I'm getting over a cold. My throat's a bit rough, so my voice isn't in the best of shape. This paper is, I'm not going to hold the mic.
He's going to use this one.
Thanks. This paper is the product of research I conducted last summer on a Princeton Library Fellowship. I used this fellowship to survey and photograph and examine paratextual audition notices, sama'at, or tibaq, in the 912 hadith manuscripts in the Robert Garrett collection. This collection consists of a number of sub-collections. The Yehuda collection, which has diverse origins ranging from Morocco to India, but predominantly Egyptian and Syrian. Yehuda did not provide information on where he acquired the entirety of his collection, but he did provide this information on the medical manuscripts in his collection, which you can see here. And as far as I can tell, this is more or less representative of the entirety of the collection. The Helwani collection is another major sub-collection and has Medinese, Syrian, and Egyptian origins. The Barudi collection, acquired in 1925, was built by Murad Bey al-Barudi, who was actually a pharmacist trained here at AUB, but unfortunately for AUB, after his death, his son sold the collection to Robert Garrett. His collection is largely Levantine and Egyptian. The paratextual elements in this collection, including audition notices, are not cataloged, so the only way to find them is to examine each manuscript. So I spent 7 hours a day for a month going through every folio of these 912 hadith manuscripts, finding and photographing audition notices. What I discovered is that slightly more than 10% of these manuscripts contain audition notices. Many of these contain more than one notice, giving us a total corpus of 223 audition notices. These range in date from 417 to 1273. The majority, however, some 163, are Mamluk from the 7th, 8th, 9th, and early 10th centuries. Before I began looking at these manuscripts, I studied protocols for composing audition notices as elaborated in a number of Mamluk era usul hadith works. Hadith specialists had been elaborating the theoretical protocols for the composition of notices of audition from as early as the 5th century with al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. These protocols were then further articulated by Ibn Salah in the 7th century in his highly influential work, Ulum al-Hadith. The protocols laid out by Ibn Salah were then commented on and elaborated extensively by hadith specialists and the Mamluk Sultanate, including Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Jamah, Zarkashi, al-Iraqi, Ibn Hajar, al-Sakhawi, and Suyuti, among others. These protocols outline everything from where the sama' or the audition notice is to be composed in the manuscript to the elements it should consist of and the order in which they should be arranged. When I began going through the Princeton audition notices, I found that they did not follow these protocols in a number of ways. One of the first points I noticed was the placement of the audition notice within the manuscript. The Mamluk era protocols following Ibn Salah and Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi before him suggest that the ideal place to position the notice is above the basmala on the first folio of the text in the upper, preferably right margin. The reason stated for positioning the audition notice here is that it is the most prominent position in the manuscript, and as such, in the words of al-Sakhawi, the notice will not be, quote, concealed from those needing to consult it, end quote. In other words, it will be one of the first things one sees upon opening a manuscript. Having opened some 900 manuscripts searching for audition notices, I can appreciate this. A further explanation given for positioning the notice here is that if this folio is separated from the manuscript, the notice will remain next to the title of the text, as without the title, the notice would be of little value. Or again, to quote Sakhawi, quote, whoever finds it, i.e. this orphaned audition notice, will be in a state of confusion. Having encountered such orphan notices, I can also appreciate this. This protocol, however, was very rarely followed in this corpus of audition notices. In fact, there are only 2 cases, and only one is Mamluk. Here, the Kitab al-Shukr of Ibn Abi Dunya. The extreme rarity of audition registers composed in this position in the margin above the basmala, in spite of the protocol's preference for this, is perhaps due to practical concerns. Positioning the notice in the margin next to the basmala has a number of practical disadvantages. For one, there's generally not much room to compose a lengthy notice in this place in the manuscript. This position could work for composing a brief notice involving a small number of auditors, but is not well suited to recording more detailed notices with larger groups of auditors, nor does it allow for the composition of multiple notices. Another disadvantage of this position, and generally with outside margins of a manuscript, is that they are some of the more vulnerable parts of a manuscript. Margins are subject to wear due to use and handling, and the corners in particular are some of the more commonly damaged parts of a manuscript. Indeed, we have a number of examples in the Princeton Samat of partially obliterated audition notices on corners and margins. Here's one example, another at the top of the page. Here, it was trimmed, and here, just wear. So given these problems, we are left wondering why the authors of the protocols maintained this preference for positioning the notice here. It is not as if they were working solely in the realm of theory. All of these authors were extensively involved in hadith transmission and had no doubt consulted hundreds, if not thousands, of notices. Perhaps this is a case of deference to authority. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi was one of the first scholars to discuss the composition of audition notices, and he preferred composing the notices next to the Bismillah because, he explains, his shuyukh did that. Perhaps Ibn Salah and his commentators followed suit and reiterated this preference in spite of the fact that in practice this position was less than ideal in a number of ways. While preferring that the audition notice be composed on the first page of the text, it was recognized that it was also acceptable, though not ideal, for the notice to be composed elsewhere in the manuscript. And when present, the title folio was one fairly common place to compose audition notices. This is perhaps because composing the notice on the title folio prevents the possibility of the creation of an orphaned and unidentifiable audition notice. This position also has the advantage of generally providing more space to compose longer or multiple audition notices. In total, some 29 of the Princeton Hadith manuscripts have one or more audition notices on the title. You have here some examples. Here's one signed by Ibn Abdul Hadi, dated 897. This has several 9th century notices. While there's some diversity in the positioning of audition notices within these manuscripts, by far the most common position is on the final folios after the colophon, or on folios attached to the end of the text. This seems to be natural enough place to compose an audition notice. After completing a reading of a manuscript, a notice would be composed in whatever space was available following the text. While the Mamluk protocols recognized that not everyone was following the preferences for composing the audition notice next to the Basmalah and accepted the composition of notices elsewhere in the manuscript, they did so with the stipulation that the title of the text should be mentioned in the audition notice, again, as a precaution in case the notice was separated from the remainder of the manuscript. This, however, is another point where theory and practice part ways. With the vast majority of the Princeton audition notices, more than 90%, making no reference to the title of the text, and instead simply saying something like, Sami'a hadha juz, or Sami'a jami' hadha al-mujallad, or something along those lines. Where is it? The title is mentioned in only 14 audition notices. It is worth noting that for the most part, these audition notices are for more well-known works, such as the Sunan of Tirmidhi, the Sahih of Muslim and Bukhari, and the Shifa of Qadi Iyad. According to the protocols articulated by Ibn Salah and his commentators, in addition to the title, there are a number of other pieces of information that should also be included in a proper audition notice. The location where the audition occurred is among this information. This, however, is another point of considerable divergence of theory and practice, with only 37 out of 164 audition notices in this corpus mentioning location. Although this is a fairly small sample, a couple of interesting points emerge from these notices. First, while the recommendation of As-Sakhawi and others is to mention, quote, the city or the village where the audition took place, many give much more detailed information. This information provides us with an indication of the diversity of locations where auditions were held. For example, we have here a notice that was held, quote, in a house on the bank of the Tigris, or here in the Khalwa of the Musmi' on the roof of the Hakam Mosque in 1772. One of the more remarkable aspects of these audition notices that mention location is that although in general there are as many, if not more, manuscripts from Egypt than from Syria, there are far more audition notices from Syria than from any other place. There are a handful of notices from Egypt, a few from Jerusalem, a few from Hebron, 2 from Iraq, 1 from Mecca, but 25 of the total 37 audition notices that mention location record Syrian locations. Most are in and around Damascus. The Umayyad Mosque and the Dar al-Hadith, where is it? The Dar al-Hadith and Nouriya are common locations, but various locations within the Salahiyya suburb of Damascus, including the Jama' al-Mudaffari and the Deir al-Hanabila, are the most commonly mentioned, occurring in 18 notices, nearly half the total. This is obviously a very limited sample, but this would seem to support and confirm what we already know of Salahiyya as an important center of hadith transmission, which I would suggest is due to the centrality of the recitation and transmission of hadith to the piety of the Hanbalis of Salahiyya. It is worth noting that once the location of an audition is mentioned in one notice, there seems to be a tendency for the subsequent notices in the same manuscript to also note the location of the audition. This provides us with a glimpse into the lives of these manuscripts and the variety of spaces where they were read and heard. Further, in some cases, this allows us to trace the itinerary of traveling manuscripts. For example, here we have a juz that starts out being read in Aleppo in the year 625. Then we have no information on location for the next two auditions in 638 and 646. Then it is read again in Aleppo, the second red underlined bit, in the Khanqa of Ibn al-Ajami, still in Aleppo. Then, more than 100 years later, it is read in the shop of a descendant of one of the auditors in the previous notice, Ishaq ibn Abi Bakr ibn Ibrahim al-Nahas, in the copper market in Damascus in the year 750. Then, 40 years later, it is read in Salahiyya in the house of one Nasr ad-Din, Abi Abdullah Muhammad ibn Dawood ibn Hamza al-Maqdisi, in the monastery of the Jerusalemites. Then, 100 years later, in 1897, it is read again by Yusuf ibn Abdul Hadi to his children in Salahiyya. In another Princeton manuscript, the audition notice tells us that the manuscript went back and forth between Damascus and Cairo, then to Jerusalem, and then on to Hebron. It is no wonder why the scholars who articulated these protocols recommend the location be included. And it is unfortunate that those composing the notices did not follow this advice more frequently. The date of the audition is another piece of information that Ibn Salah and his commentators considered essential to an audition notice. Thankfully, this protocol is, for the most part, followed. But there are, of course, exceptions, with a handful of notices that provide very sparse information. Here, for example, we just have Ibrahim ibn Muhammad al-Hanbali heard it. And where is it? Here, Ibn Abdul Hadi says, my son Abdul Hadi heard this from me. In some cases, the date is not mentioned because the audition notice was only recorded long after the actual audition, as you can see here. Wait, no, that's not the right one. Where is it? Apparently, I lost that slide. Another point where theory and practice are at odds in these audition notices involves the stipulation that all of the auditors in attendance be recorded in the notice. In many notices, however, after noting the names of a few, likely the more prominent attendees, the scholar composing the audition notice simply alludes to the presence of others, other unnamed auditors, using a phrase like, and others, وآخرون, or and a group of others, وجماعة منهم. In some cases, like the one here that was composed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this was because there were simply too many people to be recorded. The author of this notice writes, the auditors were innumerable, so we recorded the elite, the ayan of them, from the people of Damascus and Aleppo and Jerusalem. This case, however, is somewhat unique, as this audition was part of the celebration of a child having successfully recited from memory a primer on tajweed. As part of this celebration, a selection of hadith were read, after which this audition notice was recorded. Adding to the festive context in which this notice was recorded is the fact that it was also during the last 10 days of Ramadan in the Masjid al-Aqsa. All that is to say that there were far more people there than would be at most auditions. I would venture that in most of the cases where some auditors were not mentioned in the audition notice, it was not because they were too numerous to feasibly record, but rather because it was simply inconvenient to do so. When commenting on excluding auditors from audition notices, many authors of commentaries on Ibn Salah note that Abu Tahir al-Salafi, when composing audition notices, would only record the most prominent auditors and simply acknowledge the younger, less prominent auditors with the phrase, and others. This seems to be likely what happened in many of these audition notices. The protocols note, however, that this practice is unacceptable and warn that one should be wary of not recording the names of some auditors due to, quote, a corrupt motive. The notice on Princeton 1357 Yehuda may provide a further explanation as to why some auditors were not recorded in these notices. Here we have a notice composed in Cairo in 838. You'll notice the underlined section here reads, وَآخِرُونَ كُتِبُوا, or maybe كَتَبُوا عَلَى الْأَصْلِ الْمَقْرُوء مِنْهُ. So we seem to have an audition session with at least two manuscripts present, this one and another that was being used to read aloud from. All of the auditors were recorded in the asl, that is the Sheikh's original audition copy, which was being read from, and would seem that complete notice was intended to function as a sort of public audition notice, while this shorter notice was intended to be a more personal notice for this select group of friends and relatives. The reader of the audition notice, Burhan ad-Din al-Baqai, who is referred to as our friend, Sahibuna, by Abu Fadl, Abdurrahman al-Qalqashandi, who composed the notice, his brother, Ala ad-Din, and Najm ad-Din ibn Fahd al-Makki. The audition notice recorded in the Sharabisi's copy of the text with all the auditors' names must have been a considerably longer text. And when reading the protocols, I got the sense that this longer type of notice, a more formal document, is what they had in mind. They in fact note that a notice should be recorded for each session of the audition. And if any auditors were absent for a session or more, that absence should be noted. While this practice is not unheard of, and Conrad has written about notices of this nature, there are very few of these types of audition notices in this corpus. Indeed, in contrast to the formality that seems to be suggested in these protocols, the overwhelming majority of these notices exhibit a degree of informality. They are, for the most part, small groups, rarely more than 10, most 5 or less. Thus far, I've noted a number of points where theory and practice diverge. By way of conclusion, one final point where theory and practice agree is in the terminology used to refer to audition notices. Both use the terms tabaqa, plural tibaq, sama, as you can see in these slides. Never in this corpus or in the theoretical literature is it referred to as ijazat as-sama, as has been common in the secondary literature from at least as early as the 1950s with Salah al-Munajjid's article. Why is there this discrepancy in the terminology between the primary and secondary sources? I would suggest that it is based on a persistent misunderstanding of the nature and function of audition notices. From Munajjid and perhaps earlier, these documents have often thought to be a kind of diploma or certificate. And we can see here Munajjid saying just that. A certificate acknowledging the auditor's mastery of the text. And this understanding was imposed on the sources through use of this term, ijazat as-sama. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. These documents are not about the oral transmission, are about the oral transmission of a text, and are not primarily about education, though that could be a secondary result. The primary function, however, is transmission of the text, hearing the text, and thereby being able to pass it on through an oral chain of transmission. Indeed, as is explained in detail in the Usul al-Hadith genre, one need not even understand Arabic to be recorded as an auditor. That is to say, an auditor does not even need to understand what is being read, much less master it. And we commonly see young children, even as young as a few months old. Completely unlearned illiterates could also be recorded in audition notices, and indeed, one of the most popular Mamluk transmitters and a key figure in virtually all chains of transmission for al-Bukhari, Abu Abbas al-Hajjar, was indeed an illiterate stonemason. It is not uncommon for an ijazah of transmission to be granted in an audition notice, but this is an ijazat al-riwaya, not ijazat al-diraya. This ijazah of transmission, sometimes found in audition notices, in no way attests to the understanding of the recipient. Indeed, in 3 separate manuscripts at Princeton, an-Nawawi gives ijazah to all living Muslims. This confusion in terminology is a reflection of the fact that although we have recently had a few excellent studies of audition notices, we have only begun to scratch the surface of this incredibly rich and extensive documentary source. The vast majority of this material remains unsurveyed, uncatalogued, and unknown. Work in this direction will no doubt greatly enrich our understanding of Mamluk societies and more broadly of Islamic social and intellectual history. Thank you.